All right, we are going to begin the Book of Esther. I think you'll enjoy this. A lot of people have seen movies about Esther, probably heard stories about Esther, and I'm sure there's been other Bible studies about Esther. So some of this may not be new to some of you all. Some of you all, this may be your first go round, or at least an in-depth that I have for you to understand this particular book. I love the story. I think it's very powerful. In the Jewish faith, it is highly recognized, almost as much as Passover. So I hope that you get some information and some education regarding this. But I do love the Book of Esther, so we will begin. We want to begin just like I did last time. I've got the overview of this Book of Esther by the Bible Project. So enjoy.
The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from the land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the Book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. The main characters in the story are two Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in the story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now, this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once, which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days, and it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. It's like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before him. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls dice. A die is called pur, Hebrew. That away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther is going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery. She purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, "If I perish, I perish." Now, in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night, the king can't sleep, and he has the royal chronicles read to him, good bedtime reading, and he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution, and the king in that moment orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now, this moment in the story is a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that, first of all, she's Jewish, and second, that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now, the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made for Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decree day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember, Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now with his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees. Yeah. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end, they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edict banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center, you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scene, and then Esther's 2 banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story. Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking, anger, sex, and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles for eating impure foods. And so the story is not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral examples, as if it endorses all of their behavior. But they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things give them down. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we begin, why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? The book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history. And he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it work, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. That's what the book of Esther.
Let's dig into this. We're going to start with the overview of the book. The book of Esther, also known in Hebrew as the Scroll, is a book in the third section of the Hebrew Bible. It is one of the 5 scrolls in the Hebrew Bible and later became part of the Christian Old Testament. The book relates the story of a Hebrew woman in Persia born as Hadassah, but known as Esther, who becomes queen of Persia and thwarts a genocide of her people. The story forms the core of the Jewish festival of Purim, during which it is read aloud twice, once in the evening and again the following morning. So yes, it is a 2-day festival that they hold. The books of Esther and the Song of Songs are the only books in the Hebrew Bible that do not mention God. I found that very, very interesting. But like you said, it's the moral ambiguity of the story that allows you to see that even though you don't, it's not speaking about God, you see his presence there and you see his inner workings with Esther, with Mordecai, to be able to change, just like Joseph said, what Satan meant for bad, God turns it to the good. And that's exactly what happens in this book of Esther. So in introduction, as we begin this Esther Bible study, let's consider the books of, you have to read Ezra and Nehemiah. In those books, we saw a large group of Jews who returned to Judah and Jerusalem after the exile. But what about the Jews who did not return to Jerusalem? There were a lot who didn't go. There were some who stayed back in Babylon and Persia. Why? I don't know. I believe a lot of it is the same reason why even us today, we get saved, but there's still a part of our former lives that we just don't want to let go of because we're comfortable there. And we struggle with a lot of things in our flesh because we've lived in our flesh for so long. And now we have a newness, but that old flesh still calls us back to do the things that we used to do. It's kind of hard sometimes to just push that out and to move on, but this is what has happened with some of them. There were quite a few who did not go. Were they still God's covenant people? Yes. So that's what the book of Esther seeks to answer. That even though there were those that did not go to Jerusalem, they still had the covenant relationship that God said that they would have, and he still says they have it today. That covenant relationship has never ended. So here's an outline. There are 5 main sections of this book. You have the introduction, which we're going to really hit to a lot today. There's 3 middle sections that develop and deliver the story, and then there's a conclusion that wraps things up. So let's begin. This is chapter 1. We're talking about the king and his glory. Esther 1, verses 1 through 4. And remember, the main scriptures will be in the New King James Version. As we go verse by verse, we're going to deal in the New Living Translation. So it says, now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. I don't know if I pronounce that right, but that's how I'm going to pronounce it. This is the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, rather large area. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. So let's begin. So let's deal with King Ahasuerus. These events happened in the days of the king. He's also known as Xerxes the First. So a lot of people would know more by Xerxes. They've heard more Xerxes than they have Ahasuerus, but that is his name. He's also known as Xerxes the First, who reigned over 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. Generally, again, identified as Xerxes the First, and his reign was between 485 and 464 BC. So you're looking at close to 19, almost 20 years that he reigned during this time. He reigned over 127 provinces. Now, if you know where Ethiopia is, that is in the northern parts of Africa. Actually, it's right up under Egypt is where Ethiopia is. Then go there and then go all the way to India. So you got all of the Middle East, all of that. He reigned over 127 provinces, rather large area. Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, and at that time, his empire from his royal throne was at Susa or Susha, and it was a fortress, rather impressive. Place was Sushan or Susa. And again, being a fortified palace, you can imagine it was well guarded, well built, unable to be attacked or overthrown or taken. He was very powerful. But as you begin to see about this man, power a lot of times has a way of messing with you or what you think you are. Third year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and the servants. He gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. He invited all the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as the princes and nobles of the provinces. So every leader, every official that was over all these provinces, 127 of them, they all gathered for a feast. Nobles and princes, and he showed the riches of his kingdom. The celebration lasted 180 days. That's 6 months. Now, I've thrown parties before, but I ain't never had no 6 months. 6 months. A tremendous display of the opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty. Yeah, this is what blew my mind. How you gonna have a party for 6 months? Day and night and day and night for 6 months. Yeah, that's a party. The honor of his excellent majesty is what was shown for, again, 180 days in all. So we have a king named Ahasuerus. This man is the king of Persia. He actually is the one who came after King Darius, whom we saw in Ezra. When you read the book of Ezra, you read about Darius. Darius is the one under whom the temple was finally rebuilt after they were captured and went into Babylonian captivity. And the temple was destroyed. So that's where you have Nehemiah and Ezra helping to come forward to rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. He throws an an extravagant party for his nobles, some elite folks in a circle of influence. Party lasted for, again, half a year, 6 months. King Ahasuerus comes across as a fairly extreme man. That's saying very lightly. He does things quickly and decisively. Or you could say hastily and thoughtlessly. Yeah, but he's the king. He can do what he wants. It's good to be the king. You do what you want. So let's go to part 2, the party and the queen, in Esther 1, verses 5 to 9. When these days were completed, the 180, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel. from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So for 7 days, you got a feast that's for the rest of the people who were attendants to his fortified city where his palace was. It says there were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars. And the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. I can just visualize this place is beautiful. And it's large. We're not talking about, your living room. We're talking about this is just the court of the garden of the king's palace. So it's to house all of that. Remember now, you didn't had 180 guests. I'm sorry, 127 guests there for 6 months. Now you got an additional 7 days. He didn't get rid of them. He pulls in everybody else from around his kingdom that's there in the palace and there that was in the fortified city to come, and now everybody gets to party. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory. For so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So here we go, a party is thrown for everyone, not just the nobles. When it was all over, the king gave a banquet for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were in the fortress of Susa. It lasted for 7 days. It was held in the courtyard of the palace of the garden. Keep going. Got 7 days. Tells you where it is. Talks about its beautiful decorations. Courtyard was beautifully decorated with white cotton curtains and blue hangings, which were fastened with white linen cords and purple ribbons to silver rings embedded in marble pillars. This was jazzy. Jazzy. Gold and silver couches stood on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Yeah, this place was this was it. Porphyry. Yeah. Again, white and blue, the curtains. This tells you all about what it was. The couches. And then we go, drinks were served in gold goblets of many designs. And there was an abundance of royal wine, reflecting the king's generosity. We're not talking about, your little fancy crystal. We're talking about gold goblets, and the Bible says each one was different. So my goodness, how many did there have to be? That each one was different, and you had 187 days of using these. Man, we're talking about this. I can't even imagine the type of party that was thrown like this. Me and Michelle have thrown some parties, but ain't nothing like this. Each vessel being different from others. Royal wine in abundance according to the generosity of the king. Drinking was not compulsory by either of the king. No limits were placed on the drinking. For the king had instructed all his palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted. Which meant, number one, there had to be a whole lot of wine. And number two, you could drink as long and as much as you wanted. Okay. Now, those of you who have been in the streets, I don't know about you, but I know on at least one occasion, or maybe two, I've drank myself sober. So if you haven't, you don't know what that experience is like. I do. You drink so much that you know, and it's not that you drink it quickly, it's just over this amount of time to where you keep drinking, and then it's like you were drunk, but you're not drunk anymore, and you're just drinking for drink's sake. It don't mean nothing. So think about 187 days of drinking. And it ain't just drinking. You got revelry. You've got all kinds of stuff going on in these 187 days of party. No limits were placed on the drinking. They should do according to each man's pleasure. So whatever you wanted to do, you could do. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on, not just drinking. But you got Queen Vashti, was his king. At the same time, she gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. Made a feast for the women belonging to the king. They were more than likely his concubines. This time you had the queen, but he had a whole bunch of women that he could have his pleasures with whenever he wanted. They were called concubines. It was a party for everyone, last 7 days. At the end of this section, we see the king has a queen. Her name is Vashti. She's holding a party for the women who belong to the king, probably the king's concubines. Going into number 3, the king's command. Esther 1, 10 through 11. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, meaning he was drunk, he commanded, now these are the eunuchs. So please don't, I'm going to try to pronounce these, but I'm only going to do it once. Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus. He commanded them to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing her royal crown in order to show her beauty to the people and officials, for she was beautiful to behold. Now there are those who say that's all he wanted her to wear was her crown, which meant she'd be naked. Now the Bible doesn't really state that, but I've read where some theologians do believe that that's when it puts it this way, that's all he wanted her to wear was her royal crown. Okay. On the 7th day of the feast, King Xerxes was in high spirits or drunk because of the wine. He told his 7 eunuchs that attended him, or the king was merry, commanded the 7 eunuchs. Here's all their names. He says, to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was very beautiful. Wearing her crown, show her beauty to the people and the officials. She was a beautiful woman. But now think about it, after doing all this drinking, you can't see your hand before your face anyway. But this is this king who is so full of himself. He's drunk. The first thing he thinks about is, let me get my queen. Bring her on out here. Put that crown on. I'm gonna show off what all I've already showed you all my opulence by looking at my palace. I've showed you how much wine that you could drink, and I'm sure that there was food as well. But it really centered on the wine because they want to show you how drunk everybody was, what they had to go through. The king's heart was merry with wine. Last day of the feast of the folks of Shushan. In that merriness, he wants his queen to come. He has shown all his royal bounty during the whole time the queen was entertaining other guests. So she had things she was doing as well. So he wants to show the people his beautiful queen. But we come to the refusal. Verses 12 to 18. But Queen Vashti refused to come to the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. And the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner towards all who knew law and justice. Those closest to him being, I'm going to say these names again, Karshina, these are different ones now. Karshina, Sethar, Admantha, Tarshish, Merish, Marsina, and Memucan. Remember that last one. 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access to the king's presence, who ranked highest in the kingdom. So these were 7 princes who knew the law and who knew how to inform the king how to mete out the justice. Because you guys still remember, he's drunk. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs? And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report. King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they had heard of the behavior of the queen, thus therefore will be excessive contempt and wrath. So what they're saying is, since your wife, the queen, has refused you, our wives as princes, they're going to refuse us, and we can't have that. So Queen Vashti refuses to come, says that she refused to come, and it made the king mad. He burned with anger. He was furious, burned within him. The king consults his wise advisors. Immediately consulted with his wise advisors who knew all the Persian laws and customs, for he always asked their advice. That is that's a lot of wisdom though as well. Still being the king and still being able to make and rule, you do need advisors. You do need those that you can go to. When I became my very first stint getting into management, one of the things that I learned was I don't have to actually know the job. I need to hire people who know the job. I'm not supposed to do it. I need to have those I know are capable of doing the job and can advise me and help me lead everyone. That's the way it is with the president. The president doesn't run the country. He has all those under him who advise him. He's got the power of veto more than anything. There are other things that he can do, but without his cabinet, he's nothing. And that's the way it is here with this king. He's the king, he's over everything, but he's got advisors that help him who all know the laws and the customs. It was his manner to always go to them whenever he had to make a judgment based upon the law of justice. The 7 princes, here's their names. They met with the king regularly and held highest positions in the empire. There's their names. I'm not going to pronounce them again, but remember Memucan. They met with the king, held high positions. So what shall we do to Queen Vashti? What must be done to Queen Vashti, the king demanded? What penalty does the law provide for a queen who refuses to obey the king's orders properly sent through his eunuchs? So that's what he wants to know. What's to be done according to the law? Because she didn't obey my command as the king. So Memucan answers before the king and the princes. Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your empire. He put her on blast. She wronged everybody. You don't disobey the king. But she did. She not only wronged the king, but everybody. All the people, all the princes. So Memucan says the women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to their contempt and anger. Yeah, man, they're like, oh, now we can't have this. Become known to all women, they'll despise their husbands because she refused to come before the king. Noble ladies of Persia will say to all the king's officials, but I heard what she did. And if she could do it, we can do it. There will be excessive contempt and wrath. So here's the king's decree. It's Esther, the first chapter, verses 19 to 22. It says, if it please the king, this is Memucan again. If it please the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of Persia and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and that the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the language of his own people. Now, you know that ain't going over today, don't you? You brothers on the line, you know this is not going over today. So
Not.
it ain't happening.
Right.
But this is what the king did. And remember when we saw the overview, when the king made a proclamation, it stood. It could not be changed. He couldn't even change it. Once he stated it, once it's written, once it's stamped, once it's sealed, it becomes a law, and not even the king can change it. So that's what he did. Booted her out. Here we go. So please the king, he suggests, if it please the king, suggests that you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and Medes, that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives. The king and his nobles thought this made good sense, so he followed Memucan's counsel. Recorded in the law of the Persians and Medes, and it cannot be altered. Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus. She is stripped of her crown. That the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. The king's decree will proclaim throughout all his empire. All wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. He sent letters from all the king's provinces. He sent letters to all parts of the empire, to each province in its own script and language, proclaiming that every man should be the ruler of his own home and should say whatever he pleases. Right. Try that, Victor. Try that, Billy. Try that, Greg. Try that, Malcolm. Right. Each province in its own script, to every people in their own language, that each man should be master of his own house and speak the language of his own people. This is how this begins. And throughout this whole time, we're talking a drunken mess. Everybody, they are just, the king is so wasted, that sounds good to me. And everybody else, let's just make this decree, and women, y'all got a place to be, and it ain't to be ruler over this house. You cannot disagree, you cannot disobey, you better do everything we say, because if not, you're going to lose your position, and we'll get somebody else better than you. If the king can do it, we're princes, we're leaders, we can do it too. Y'all better straighten up. So the queen publicly defied the king. King Ahasuerus then asked his wise men and counselors what he should do in response to this disobedience. One counselor in particular advised the king that Queen Vashti's disobedience could have far-reaching consequences. Counselors suggest that when all the ladies in Persia hear of this, they'll be encouraged to disrespect their own husbands. So the counselor thinks of a solution. It doesn't involve executing Vashti or anything like that. It simply involves the king not allowing Vashti to come before his presence, and then the king will find someone more worthy of being queen in Vashti's place. King likes that idea and sends letters throughout his kingdom declaring that Vashti did what she did and how he handled the situation. One of the things that I believe it started more with World War II. When the men were taken, or the men went off to war, and the women now became heads of their households because the men weren't there. They went to work. They had been housewives, but now they're forced to go out and make a living. There's an independence that they have that they hadn't had before. So when the men came back, these women, although they still knew their role and their men were back, it was hard for them to relinquish some of this power and authority that they've had. So that began a shift in the relationship of who's the head of the house. And from then on up, and even up until now, the men's role, fathers, husbands, have become so, what's the word I want to use? Demoralized, or less powerful. We see that in so many different programs that you watch. One of the longest running animated shows in history is The Simpsons. I hate that show. I couldn't watch that show. I think I tried watching when it first came out, and I'm like, I can't watch this stuff. Because Homer's the dumbest thing you wanted to see. He's the father, he's the head, but he's dumb. You got Married with Children. And they're showing these men and these husbands and the heads of the homes as the dumbest, worthless, and that is carried down through to where, there's no longer what God had had wanted us to be as the head, but still have enough sense to know even how to treat your wife and your children with respect, with honor, and blessing, and being the guardian and the guard over them, with them, so that you can have a harmonious relationship. So when you get to this right here, you see what is being done even today. Men have become so powerless in the home. And that's what happened here. And the king says, okay, guys, what should we do? She just disobeyed me. And they're like, look, if she's gonna do that to you, our wives gonna do that to us, and every woman in the whole kingdom gonna do that to their husband. Now we can't have that. So let's do this. Strip her, then all these women know she's been stripped, so they'll have a fear of doing the same thing she did, and we'll get back into the place of being the head over everything. So let's see how it plays out, even going further from here. So this was the introduction to the book of Esther in the first chapter. So quick questions for reviews, and then we can get done. What are the main points of this chapter? There's actually 5 of them. You have the king and his glory, which is verses 1 through 4. You have the party and the queen, verses 5 through 9. You have the king's command, verses 10 through 11. You have the queen's refusal, which was 12 through 18. And you have the king's decree, which was 19 through 22. These are the main points of this chapter. Who was the king and how long did he reign? Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes the First.
Xerxes, yes, Xerxes.
And his reign was between 485 and 464 BC, approximately 19 to 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
That he reigned. How many provinces did he rule over? 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Who did the king invite to his feast?
Different places
All
helps it to stay.
The officers, here we go, the officers of Persia and Midian, the nobles and princes of the provinces. How long did the feast last?
7 days.
180 days.
180
6
days.
months. I can't even imagine. Well, the first feast was for 180 days. Then he threw another 7, because the first feast was just for the officers and the nobles and the princes. Then the last 7 days was actually for the rest of the kingdom.
I'm done on the first day.
Man, look, you talk about 6 months. I can't, and the thing is, they're just telling you about the wine. Think about all the food that had to be served. You ain't gonna just drink for 6 months. You gotta eat, you gotta sleep, you gotta wake up and keep going for 6 months. Yeah. What was the name of the queen?
Vesti.
Nasty.
Queen Vesti.
Yeah. What did the king command the queen to do?
Come to him.
Come out with just her crowning.
Wear her royal crown. And show her beauty to the people and the officials. What was the queen's response to the king's command?
She said no. She refused.
She was entertaining other guests. The other guests were actually his concubines or his other women that he ran. So it doesn't tell you how many there were, but think about it. If he's got a kingdom that goes from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, he's got a lot of everything. You can imagine all the concubines he had that she has. She's entertaining us. She's throwing a party like he's throwing a party. So she refuses to come.
Yep.
And I don't think it was just because she was entertaining. I think the way that he wanted her to come and knowing how drunk he was and why he wanted her to come, just to show her off. How did the king handle the queen's refusal?
He went to his advisors and asked.
Was
He was mad.
furious. He was hot.
Mhm.
And he consults with his wise advisors.
Yes, yes.
What did one of the princes say about the queen's refusal?
There were consequences.
She not only
And she would
wronged
get all the other
king,
wives.
but she also wronged all the princes and all the people who were in all the provinces of the king. So her refusal was huge,
Yes.
and it set about a chain
Yep.
that caused the rest of this whole book to now take a pivotal change. What was the king's decree? She should come no more before the king. That the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So you are no longer queen, I'm gonna get me another. So that's chapter 1. A lot going on there, a lot of partying, a lot of drinking, a lot of eating, a lot of revelry, refusals, banishment, laws being written, the whole kingdom now being shaken and put back into a place that he thinks and they think it ought to be. So our next lesson, we're going to go back into chapter 2 of the book of Esther. And we